bit late because things happened. And life can be terrible sometimes. Yep, there we go. That's good. That's good. There we go. All right. Yeah, life happened. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit late, and whew, it's been a long day. I need to minimize all of this, otherwise I'm going to be staring at the wrong thing the whole time. Oh, good. Restart Steam. Go for it. Go for it. You did it twice yesterday. Why not? Anyway. So, let's talk Thriller Bark. Because I'm running late because Granny needed some stuff done and I delayed everything and I'm oof. Thriller Bark. A lot of the people that don't think Skypiea is the weakest arc will point to Thriller Bark as the weakest arc. And while I do understand some of their arguments, Sanji is pretty badly portrayed in Thriller Bark, and it hurts his character overall to varying degrees of severity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, even though I've already kind of talked about that multiple times already, because it's one of those things that is happening in One Piece that isn't necessarily a conversation that people are ready to tackle. It's the wrong it's an okay conversation happening at the wrong time. Is kind of the problem. Like it's so, but like from a writing standpoint is what I mean when I say Skypiea is the weakest. From a just sheer writing standpoint, in terms of pace and interest, Thriller Bark manages to beat out Skypiea pretty easily. Thriller Bark is paced very quickly. It does not feel like there's much drag, especially compared to later stories like Fishman Island, Dressrosa, and some parts of Whole Cake where there and Wano where there does feel like there's a little bit of this slowdown as you're getting information. Thriller Bark doesn't have much of that. Most of its information dumps are on the back end of it, which really helps because it means that there's not a whole lot of info dumping happening in Thriller Bark, and part of that is on purpose. Thriller Bark is really a love letter to classic horror stories. You know, your Draculas, your Frankensteins. Like, it takes its themes and ideas almost directly from those classic stories. Every arc, by the way, does this. They all have source books, source stories that they get their style and ideas from, and then add some charm and twists and new stuff, you know, which helps to give it, you know, this fresh feeling, this fresh and expansive sensation that we get from the world of One Piece. And this is, you know, where, like, I have talked to many people, and usually the dividing line is, are you a fan of somewhat classic horror or not? And it's strange because I'm not a fan of most horror. However, I am a pretty strong fan of the classics. I've read Frankenstein and I've read Dracula, and they're very well done books. They're very interesting. And these are classic horror stories. So that style of horror certainly appeals to me. And it's replayed here. You know, in One Piece, it's more classic than it is modern style of horror. Because it's not a slasher. It's not everybody dies. It's not gruesome. Even the zombies look silly. But it all plays into greater themes and greater ideas A lot of people have picked up on Moria being a shadow of his former self, playing on the themes of his fruit power and his abilities. And it also plays to his own themes of being owed and also the found family. The found family and the protection of family. One of the most interesting things about Moria is how much Moria cares about his crew. He cares very deeply about his crew. In fact, what broke him was that he cared so much about his crew, and Kaido wiped them out. And so he's creating a crew that can't be wiped out. Or at least, if it's wiped out, he has ways of getting them back. And then using those crew members to protect the few people that he can't necessarily do that to. Which, these are themes. These are big themes that cast their shadow, quite literally, over the next arc, where Luffy is going to nearly break. He's going to face a lot of the same pain that Moria faced and what had broken Moria. Which makes the placing of this arc and the story behind the arc all the more interesting. And this is one of those things that kind of goes around in the background of the One Piece community talking about Thriller Bark. That's one of the most interesting stories that come from... Some of it comes from Rumor Mill, but some of it comes from Oda, of what happened with Thriller Bark. And when you kind of piece together that and see how it laid out, you can come up with a pretty firm hypothesis on why Thriller Bark showed up here and some of the choices that happened inside Thriller Bark. Specifically Nightmare Luffy. So, I know for a fact that Oda has stated that Thriller Bark was supposed to occur in East Blue. Brook was supposed to be one of the first few Straw Hats. However, he didn't do that. He pushed it back. And my theory is, because this is where, he hasn't said anything one way or the other. My theory is, as he was writing up Brook's backstory, and he decided that this character's motivation should be personal, should be a person-to-person motivation to get through the Grand Line, to see his friend again. At around the same time, he has probably decided that the Grand Line is going to be a circle, start beginning and ending in the same spot. That creates a problem, because if this is happening in East Blue, he hasn't even gotten into the Grand Line yet. So now, Brook needs to be in the Grand Line. Brook needs to happen inside the Grand Line. And that now brings up new problems. Where in the Grand Line? If he puts it inside the Crocodile arc, which would be ideal. Moria is built to be the first Shibukai that Luffy fights, specifically because of Nightmare Luffy. My assumption here is that the designs for Nightmare Luffy were done well before Oda decided where to place the arc. And this is where, when you're writing, you have to make decisions. He made Nightmare Luffy as an opt for basically saying Luffy's not strong enough yet to fight a Shibukai. This is how he's going to make that gap up. This is how he's going to close that gap. Is this Nightmare Luffy ability that he steals from Moria. But the themes inside Thriller Bark just don't gel with Crocodile. And worse, if they get Brook that close to the start of the Grand Line, it is very difficult to logically make an argument that he can't just turn around and head back. It's been 50 years. There are only a handful of islands in. They're literally weeks in at this point. So, push it back. which now creates problems around Nightmare Luffy because Luffy's not only beaten a Shibukai by this point, but a visibly stronger Shibukai than Moria will be. Push it back. He decides to go with Skypiea, and then the boat becomes kind of the pressing issue. He wants to get this boat story done. And he knows the next story is going to have to be Marineford. So he takes this and he decides to use it as the last in-between. The last kind breather of a story in between the emotional pain that is Water 7 and Enies Lobby and the emotional breakdown that is Marineford. And it's fascinating because he takes this thing that was built for being in the first half of the story, and he adapts it and he adapts it and he shifts it. And this is kind of where you see some of the grinding coming down. This is where some of the odd threads are. But I don't feel very many pacing issues in this arc. It does not have the same slowdown as Skypiea, and part of that is it doesn't have the multi-factions that Skypiea has. You know, there's only the enemy faction. We've never really needed to know too much about the enemy faction in any of these stories in order for them to work. And instead, it kind of works more as a character story for the crew gelling, which is something that we kind of need now that we've suddenly picked up 3 more characters in the last few stories. You know, so we need kind of this breather to get everyone moving together, which really, really helps. And there's several important moments inside Thriller Bark, and there's several things that are going to be referenced later, and so like there's a lot of important stuff that happens. But again, like that's not something that I put up as like supporting Thriller Bark, because like I don't put that stuff up for supporting Skypiea either. Every story arc in One Piece has important moments that are referenced and used further on. That's an expected quality. That is your basics. That is your for a story like One Piece, that is the opt-in. That is the baseline. That is what's expected. Every story in One Piece is building on each other and moving the story forward. So to say, you know, any one of these stories has stuff that's referenced and important later, yeah, duh. That's the style of the story that we're reading. It should. All of them should. If they didn't, that would be a major problem. That would be a far bigger problem than anything else that Oda could do. Because it just would break the continuity of the world that he's working in. So, you know, there's where was I? Where am I? What am I doing? There's a lot to like in Thriller Bark. It is one of those arcs that are a little bit more to taste. You know, if you're not a huge classic horror fan, I'm looking to wave goodnight to Granny. If you're not a huge classic horror fan, this is going to feel a little bit weaker because it is very much foundationally based in classic horror, and that's kind of true for every arc in One Piece. This is, you know, where like your opinion, this is where the opinionation comes from, is like every story in One Piece has its basis in other stories, is drawing its inspiration from other stories, and most of those are classics. Like most of those are classic stories. That's part of the power of One Piece, is that it is drawing from the strongest parts of literature in order to tell this story. The less you know about that classic literature, the more Good night, Granny. The more difficult it's going to be to catch on to what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on underneath the trunk. the amazing thing about One Piece is that you don't need to have that background to enjoy One Piece. One Piece is written in such a way that you can watch it or read it and just enjoy it as it is, as kind of this funny pirate story. That is one of the strengths of One Piece, because it allows a lot of people in. But part of the reason that I'm doing videos like this is that there is more under the hood going on, and it is hidden in bits and pieces, but it is made very clear in some places that this story is far deeper and far more complex. And one of the things that I really love about this series is that it is a opening of the door to people who maybe haven't been engaged in literature before to explore literature more. It is saying this is what high literature looks like. You just need to give it a shot. You just need to give it more of a chance. Some of it's a little denser, but this is at the core of it. These kinds of emotional, powerful moments are what makes classic literature classic. It's that ability to evoke powerful emotions. All of the classics have that. They would not be classics otherwise. They would not have survived the tests of time. That's one of the things that I really do love One Piece for, is that it is trying to engage people. It is trying to make people understand how to be how to analyze stories, how to look at stories, how to break down what looks simple on the surface into more complicated parts. It is fascinating on so many levels. And, to me, Thriller Bark, I'm very well read, so most of these arcs have about the same amount of engagement from me. I'm always seeing references to classics and other literature sources and other stories that are being told. There's layers upon layers upon layers of references going on underneath this story. And as someone that's well read, it makes it very engaging for me, because I can constantly peel and pick at individual characters or moments or places and go, oh, here's where that came from. Here's the way that he twisted this. Here's where this idea came from. Here's what this theme is. It's just amazing. And Thriller Bark is one of those. It's one of those stories that kind of sits in the middle. It's a breather. It's fun. It's for pacing. It's to kind of pick the pace up. And this is kind of why I come down harder on Skypiea. Skypiea was serving very much the same role. Alabasta was a very emotional story arc. Very emotionally draining storyline. Skypiea is there to pick the pace up a little bit, get some happy tones, some wonder, some fun, and it doesn't do it. It doesn't manage to be emotional, and it doesn't manage to be well-paced and fun. It has the elements of that, and then the Skypiea climax is amazing, and the first part of Jaya on just Jaya is amazing. It's just this middle chunk that drags. It just grinds to a halt. It drags. Thriller Bark doesn't have that problem. we get into Thriller Bark and we go. And a large part of that is the backstory is very thin. It doesn't need a lot of backstory. This is a Shibukai. He's been beaten. He's a shadow of his former self. This is his island. It's a horror story island where he's literally creating creatures. There's not a huge amount of backstory here, which helps because it gets the pacing up. It brings the humor in. It brings the comedy in. There's a lot of strengths in here. And because it's horror, there's all of these fun things. The splitting of the crew into the cowards and the strong ones is fantastic. You know, because you can get a more typical horror story with the three cowards running around screaming their heads off, and then you get, you know, the parody of your classic horror story with Luffy pushing zombies back into the dirt, because obviously that's where they belong. Also, it's very interesting that when we get to the horror trope of picking people off, it's the three strongest. And this is, I think, the thing that was born from pushing this arc back that works to the arc's advantage. He needed to up the threat. So what way to make the threat bigger? What better way to make the threat bigger than to use this shadow system he's created to create three zombies that have the power of the three strongest crew members, and have the crew functionally fight themselves, and then pop Luffy's shadow into a literal giant. Actually, a creature bigger than regular giants, and then do something to make that thing fight in the same style as Luffy. I mean, there is a lot to be said for that big final fight. And the metaphors are definitely at play here, with Luffy having to accept the pain of the people, of the victims, in order to bring himself enough strength to push the fight at the speed that needs to be pushed to win, because ticking clock. For the crew to trap and shatter the giant's spine, to use its own weaknesses against it to topple the mountain. And then, of course, Moria taking in all of his victims, just scooping it all of that power, taking that power for himself, not necessarily making himself stronger, just holding on to it like a greedy hoarder, trying to hold on to his treasure as long as possible because he doesn't want it to go away. And then for the walls of his castle to crumble on top of him, exposing that treasure to the world. Because that wealth, that life, can't be held onto. Because, of course, we're doing a horror story. And all classic horror stories have the villainous creature be from the capitalist system, from the top, the oligarchy, hoarding the wealth. Aside from, I think, Frankenstein. Frankenstein is, I think, the only exception. Almost all the other classics, though, especially Dracula, which is what a lot of the references here are from, are about the wealthy oligarchs capturing the wealth and hoarding it and taking it from the young in order to keep themselves alive, which is the classic Dracula. And some part of that is here as well, where he is enlisting the youth to fight his battle for him, stealing the shadows and making the dead fight for him. It's fascinating stuff. It's really well done. And of course, Zoro's nothing happened moment, which is just amazing. Because Zoro's a fucking badass, and I'll talk more about Zoro being a fucking badass when I talk about Zoro specifically. I will also say another one of the most emotional moments in this series is definitely Brook's backstory, which has consistently gotten me to cry. I have downloaded that version of that song, and almost every time it comes up on my iTunes, I end up crying. So it's dangerous to have my iTunes on shuffle. I could be in sudden tears. So I do probably need to cut things short, and it's good because I Okay, well, no, hang on. Hang on. I do need to talk. I do need to re-go over this bit with Sanji and Absalom. The schism between these two, I've talked about it before, and I think it's important to really look at this in order to understand where One Piece is going, because there is this cultural difference that's going on, and it's going to show up a lot. It shows up in Wano. It shows up in Whole Cake. It shows up in Fishman Island a lot, and and anywhere where Sanji is basically just being a flirtatious bastard, is on display. And this is where it's like where I do think that this is an okay conversation to be having, but kind of the wrong climate to be having it in. Because a lot of the conversation, the public conversation right now around overly flirtatious and overly aggressive men is corporate culture, rape culture, abuse of power. And this seems to kind of fly in the face of that conversation without like refuting it or touching it or tackling it or dealing with it, really. Which is a little bit unfair because the show itself has shown that it is very well aware of this kind of thing, and it does scratch on it as much as it wants to. One Piece does a very good job of not outright saying the dark stuff, but very much implying it. Let's move over to Amazon Lily, where we see Boa Hancock's backstory, where she was enslaved as a child, forced to eat a fruit for the pleasure of the world nobles, and the implication of what happened to her and her sister's bodies is rape, is multiple times rape, lots of terrible things. But the show doesn't want to explicitly state that, and that's fine. I think it's fine for shows to not explicitly talk about these kinds of topics. Not every show needs to be so deeply into politics. And one of the benefits of not necessarily outright talking about it is several-fold, is, she's willing to name the culprits. She's willing to fight them if she gets the opportunity to. She's just waiting for the opportunity to, which is very reflective of how things like the Me Too movement have gone. A lot of women came out because they felt like they had an opportunity. They finally had a chance. They finally had the momentum to get recompense for the terrible thing that they suffered, sometimes many times. And that's fair. This world has been very cruel to women. It is understandable that many women once raped don't immediately want to talk about it. There's a lot of individual emotional issues around the actions of rape. And a large part of that is because to talk about being raped is to talk about a moment when you were weak, when you were exposed, when you were unable to protect yourself, and someone took advantage of that. And that is hard to talk about in general. Just in general. It's hard for us to talk about when we were kids and dumb and weak. In moments when we were bullied. Moments when we were hurt. Moments when we were abused. Because We don't want to talk about the times that we were weak, that we weren't able to protect ourselves, that someone took something from us. Whether that was something physical or emotional or a part of your body. That is hard to talk about, just in general. And the fact that the systems in place for catching and punishing people that do this are so shaky, and that you are going, if you put yourself forward, you are going to be under the most intense scrutiny of your life. It makes that an unhappy prospect. It makes it something that not everyone has the strength to do. Which means that a lot of people are going to just try to get over it and move on with their lives. It's not necessarily the right thing, but it is the understandable thing. It is the human thing. It is something that, when you look at the statistics and how the statistics break down, that is what is shown. A small number of people at any given point in time are able to find the mental fortitude to stand up, say this was wrong, and contest it. It is... So, the thing that One Piece does here is that it does provide that sort of cover for her. She doesn't want to talk about it. It shows that. And this is a powerful woman. Boa Hancock is incredibly powerful. And yet, she could functionally show that slave mark. And her community wouldn't care. But it is such a moment of weakness. It's something that she's ashamed of, that she's hurt of, so she doesn't want to talk about it. And this is why it's such a big moment for her to talk about it to Luffy, to open up to a stranger who has helped her, who has helped her sisters. Without necessarily knowing the whole story, he's helped them. He's helped them deeply. He's cared about every person that he's come across on the island so far. That is why all of that is so important. And that is why when it looks like he's being crass and backhanded in Thriller Bark and later in Wano with Sanji, and even in Impel Down with the Okama and the Newkama group. There is more going on underneath the surface than just ha ha ha, rape is fun. Absalom is a villain. Absalom, while he does get played up a lot for laughs, he's also not redeemable. At no point in the story is he redeemed, because he opens the story up by assaulting... He opens his part of the story up by assaulting Nami. And say what you will, like, he gets the shit kicked out of him for it and takes multiple lightning bolts from Nami. Nami's the one that finishes the fucker off. By shoving her fucking lightning bolt right into his mouth, delivering the shock directly. Like, you know, say what you will, he is not redeemed at any point in time, especially when you compare him to even Moria, who has some redemptive qualities after leaving Thriller Bark, including caring very deeply about his crew and going to try and find them and make sure that they're okay. Absalom is just, like, Absalom gets killed off screen. Like, that is how little respect he's gonna get. That's how little redemption he's gonna get. He's gonna get none. We aren't gonna feel for this bastard. And, you know, maybe he'll put up some backstory when we get into Blackbeard's thing about Absalom, but I don't I don't think it's been an important enough point for us to see any of that. I think Absalom's out, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing, and I think that's on purpose. Because, again, he opened up with assault. He assaulted Nami. And we later do get the parallel in Wano with Sanji getting his own invisible power. And then him going into the mixed bag. Again, it's annoying to me because I don't get voyeurism. It's a fetish. It's a fetish some people have. And I do understand that fetish exists, but it falls into one of those, I don't really understand what the appeal is. Like, it falls into the same category as like foot fetish for me. I don't get the appeal of it. I understand it's a fetish. I understand it's a thing that people like. And this is kind of where I know what Sanji's looking for is voyeurism. He's a hardcore voyeurist because like this is a public bathhouse, mixed bathing. Men are there ogling the girls. Like the men are there. The men are allowed in there, and the girls are there knowing that they're going to be looked at. And Sanji has chosen to put on his invisibility suit and stand in a corner invisible to watch. Because that is what he was interested in, was just watching, not being noticed, not being seen, not being part of the action or the play, just watching. And I could go into, the mental breakdowns of certain fetishes. Certain fetishes do imply certain things about about a person's personality that aren't necessarily always true, but with more information can definitely add context to certain things. Like, not to get well, I guess I'll get too personal. I have a huge transformation fetish. The action of changing from one thing to another, and a lot of that stems from devaluing myself and living a life where I wished I could literally be anything else, anything different, anything that wasn't me. That is what the body does with things like trauma. And when we get Sanji's extended backstory, lo and behold, he spent long times being declared dead and invisible to the whole island. Nobody knew he was there. The weird thing about the human mind and trauma is that a portion of that trauma, the brain just isn't going to know what to do with. And when the brain doesn't know what to do with something, it fetishizes it. It turns it into a sexual thing. That is just what the brain does. If it doesn't know what to do with something, and it doesn't necessarily have to be trauma, but generally the more extreme stuff, the more weird stuff comes from trauma. Because the brain doesn't know what to do with this emotion. It doesn't know how to express it. And if that goes unexpressed long enough, the brain starts to just kind of try and find outlets for it. And the kind of catch-all in the human psyche is sexual arousal. That's just at the bottom of the barrel. This just kind of catch-all for anything that we haven't figured out how to express and get out of our psyche. It ends up gathering at the bottom, in your sexual arousal, and these become the fetishes. These become the things that arouse you. And again, looking at this story, we have Sanji who has spent so much time alone as a child, invisible, masked, kept out of sight, out of mind, abandoned, pushed out, that it isn't surprising to me that one of his fetishes would be to be unseen around naked women. That doesn't surprise me. I don't necessarily think it's good or healthy, but it doesn't surprise me, and the fact that he never turns these actions into attack. All of it. All of his actions. He's very flirtatious. He's very aggressively flirtatious. But it's never an attack. It's never an assault. He knows at what point to stop, and he never crosses that line. He doesn't touch them unless they want to be touched, or he's saving them, That happens a lot. They're on a fucking pirate ship dealing with impossible adventures. Yeah, he's going to end up having to catch them a few times. Which he does happily, and he'll do so at the detriment of the men, because that is who he is. But he's not, taking it as an opportunity to grope them. He's not taking it as an opportunity to do more than be physically close to them. And he lets them go immediately. So, he knows where the boundaries are. He knows, and it's very clear he knows that the boundaries are different for the two girls that are on the ship. With Nami, he's very close and very flirtatious because she's a flirtatious person. We see her flirt a lot with other characters. So he gets closer to her because she's fine with it. She lets him, and she takes advantage of it. Robin, he's usually at a bit more of a distance. He's usually a few steps away because Robin's a more isolated introvert who wants her space. And he doesn't intrude on that space. He's very aware that she has her bubble, and while he can come in, and this is where things get really interesting whenever you see him with food or drink, he always offers it to Robin first. He'll usually just give it to Nami just to be close to her because the bubble for Nami's personal space bubble is much smaller. Partially due to her own sets of trauma, which, again, I don't want to turn this into a full-on character breakdown, because I'm going to do each of these characters separately. There's a lot to be done with each of these characters separately. But, you can see it. You can see that whenever he's got food, he asks Robin if she wants what he's made. First, he asks for permission to enter her bubble, and then he comes and he gives her whatever he's made, and then he leaves because he knows that she needs her space. She's an introvert. She doesn't want people close to her physically. And it's so fascinating. So it's like when he gets these moments where he's being a bit of a prat about voyeurism and seeing naked women and being flirtatious and being over sexual, it looks bad. But digging under the surface of Sanji's character, you can start to see where it's coming from, and you can start to see that as much as he's aggressive in his flirtation, he isn't going to attack the girls. He's not that type of person. He's not someone who wants to hurt women or wants to claim women. He wants to be very friendly with them. He likes being friendly with him. And frankly, again, with his backstory, it makes sense. The people that were closest to him were his sister and his mother. Those were the people that treated him like a human being. Those were the only people he could confide in. So it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense that would be how he interacts with the world. You know, his brothers were incredibly cruel to him. His father was incredibly cruel to him. A lot of men were very mean to him. He doesn't care to be around men. Men he sees as abuse. He sees men as abusive. And that is kind of the interesting... I think that's the interesting reflection that Oda is trying to bring out with this character, and with these character moments, especially in Thriller Bark, is that the way Sanji sees the world is a little bit different than the expectations we might have for a character who acts like Sanji does. And there is something squicky about it, but there is also something to be understood about it. In that he's not arguing that this is okay for Sanji to do. Sanji gets hit a lot in this story from overstepping his bounds and getting too close to women and getting too flirtatious. He gets beaten a lot for things he says, for things he does. So his actions aren't taken as good. But it's also not taken as this is an ultimate evil that needs to be crushed out of society. The thing that's being stated here is that this type of personality exists in the world. There's no way we're going to get rid of it. We just need to teach how to do it without hurting people, how to be an aggressive flirt, which is a personality type that just exists everywhere in the world. We're not going to stomp it out. It's not going to go away. These people are going to continue to live, and they're going to continue to exist. We can't remove them from society. So the next best thing is we need to learn how to live with that, and part of that is showing clearly where the boundaries are and teaching people how to act the way they're going to act without crossing the boundaries of other people's personal space. But and here's where things get complicated, because as studies come out, as more is understood about rape culture, it's also becoming more and more clear that this flirtatious personality type is not actually the primary instigator. It's not where most of the rapists are coming from. Most rapists, it's about power. For most people with rape, and this is what we see with Absalom, it's about power. It's about owning the other person. It's about controlling the other person. It's not about the sex. It's not about enjoyment or sexual relief. It's about power. It's about control. And it's usually coming from people who are family, who are in positions of power already, be it a church, be it a school, be it a doctor, be it any kind of, be it a police officer, any kind of position of power can be a place where people who seek power and seek to abuse power gather. And one of the ways people abuse power, politicians as well, especially one of the things we're learning lately, is that politicians are a big group, specifically in the U.S. Republican politicians, as it seems like every other week there's another story about another Republican politician who has raped children because of the power. Because it's all about the power. And so that is where that's where this problem is focusing the lens on where the problem is, and this is the benefits of the Me Too movement, is that it has focused the lens on the problem of rape culture. Rape culture isn't guys doing wolf whistles on the street. As much as they're annoying, and they probably need to learn to stop doing that it's not going to work out for them. um, they're not the ones going around raping people. The people that are doing most of the rape, and I'm not going to say that it never happens on the streets, but by the statistics, your boss, your boss's boss, your teachers, your pastors, your politicians, your police officers are far more likely to engage in rape. It's like 90% of the rape is coming from the positions of power. Family members that have positions of power, uncles, aunts, fathers, mothers, anybody that has a position of power. That's where it's going to happen. Like, that is most of it. That is the vast majority of it. It's not that it never happens. Date rape is fairly common. It actually accounts for most of the remaining rape. And, it might sound like these aren't, the numbers might be a little bit skewed, but you have to kind of understand how common rape is, and this is why this has been a problem, and this is why it's been something that's been talked about. Rape is fairly ubiquitous in this country at the very least, but also in other countries. They're not joking when they say, 1 in 3 women, or 1 in 2, I guess. I think this is the new statistics. The statistics shift, but they're always high. That is a huge number of people. That is a mind-boggling number of people. It might sound like a percentage, 30% to 50%, somewhere in that range. That might just sound like a percentage, but you have to understand, half the population are women, which means that almost a fourth of the entire population is getting affected by this, if not more. That is a huge number of people. COVID-19 has killed about 1% of society, of the United States society. It's getting close to the 1% mark. And it is a tragedy. It is a horrible tragedy, and it feels like it's everywhere. It feels like everyone knows someone that has died from this disease. So think about that. This is still under 1% of deaths in this society. And with rape statistics, you're talking 25 or plus % of the population that has been affected by this. That's huge. That's an enormous number of people that have been affected by rape. That is gigantic. That is incredible numbers of people. So this is why the numbers can be so skewed. This is why you can have hundreds of thousands of examples of people getting date raped at bars and not understand that for every one of those, there's 10 examples of someone in a position of power raping their child, raping their employee, raping the people in the school or in the church or wherever they've got power. That is, and the fact that those other examples aren't talked about comes again from the power, from the fact that they have the power to shut you up, to make you a pariah in your own community and get you to shut up. That is the conversation that's just kind of broiling under the surface. And it's not, and this is where kind of One Piece is failing. This is where I do say, One Piece is trying to have a conversation that's fine, but it's happening at the wrong time. Because the political climate right now around the discussion of rape is focusing on that gigantic cluster of abusive power. And while One Piece is just kind of scratching at it a little bit, it doesn't want to dig too deep, and that makes the other side of this discussion that One Piece is having look very shallow. And it makes the whole discussion feel like it's on the back burner, and it's not something Oda's interested in talking about. When what he's looking at doing is having a little bit of a more nuanced discussion that doesn't necessarily dig too deep into the topic, but kind of makes a stand on that topic. And the stance is, we kind of need to stop blaming this type of people and start looking at this type of people, which is, I think, a fair statement to say. As the statistics show, the majority of the rape that happens in society comes from those in power. And that is where we need to keep our eyes on. And, keep in mind, Thriller Bark was years ago. The Me Too movement hadn't started. But that political climate was still around. Political climate has been around for quite a while, because these are unresolved things that we, as a society, seem to choose to forever not deal with for some reason. Largely because the people that are doing these crimes have lots and lots of money and power, and are willing to put all of that money and power into making sure that we don't talk about it. Fun how that works. But unfortunately for them, you can only keep a cap on this kind of stuff for so long before it bubbles and reaches a critical mass and starts to spew. And that's kind of where we're at now. This is all bubbled over. I have splintered into multiple separate discussions, but I do feel like it all ties into what's going on in Thriller Bark, and the big bad, the thing that people always point to as the biggest failing in Thriller Bark. And while, if that is a line, that's a line for you. But I do think what's happening here is a little bit more nuanced, on the simple fact that the rest of the series is so nuanced in its discussions, that I do think he's trying to have this kind of nuanced discussion here as well. I think that this is a statement that he wants to make. And I think that people give it a lot of flack because as many strengths as I mentioned earlier, One Piece has this fantastic ability to kind of be read lightly and on the surface level, so anyone can pick it up and anyone can be a fan. Every action and every decision that an author makes is going to have strengths and weaknesses. This was a decision that worked very, very well for most of the story. However, that decision to kind of have this more lighthearted, more accessible storytelling did create this particular weak spot, where when he's trying to use metaphor and use it and take that light touch over the top, so that the discussion underneath can be had with people that want to engage with that lower discussion, and then everyone else can kind of just take the lighter path, it creates this dissonance. It creates this feeling that he is blundering through a thing that is very hurtful. And it feels like it's damaging a well-liked character. And so that is a weakness of one of the choices that he made, is that in this particular instance, having that light-hearted spackle over the top that has allowed so many people to just enter the series and enjoy it, it makes this particular discussion, this particular metaphor, vulgar, and it hurts the casual reading of the story drastically. You actually need to dig in to understand what's going on here. And that isn't necessarily something everyone's going to want to do, especially when the casual reading of these events is so bleak for Sanji. Especially when that initial cover reading makes Sanji look like a terrible person. And it's a weakness. It's something that he ended up trading that he didn't realize that he was going to be trading, and this is where a mistake was made, and in the future he does seek to correct that mistake. He does try to be a little bit more on the nose about Sanji, who Sanji is, why Sanji acts the way he does. He tries to be a bit more explicit and drag some of that out and, make sure that on the surface level, this discussion is being had on the surface level, on the top level. And it, all choices have some weaknesses. It does end up meaning that certain parts of certain arcs drag a little bit. This is where some of the Dragon Wano and Whole Cake come from, is that we're having this more nuanced discussion now. But it's necessary. He saw the backlash of what happened in Thriller Bark, and he went, all right, I have this can't be on the background. And this is what led to things like being so upfront about Boa Hancock's backstory, being so implicit about what she went through, being more on the surface about this topic than other topics that he'll touch on in this story, is this, backlash to the actions in Thriller Bark, because the casual read doesn't look good for Sanji. It really doesn't. But, as someone who does read multiple levels into the story and does see connections, I can understand where he's coming from, and I appreciate the more nuanced discussion. I do think that it may still just kind of be the wrong time to be having this kind of a discussion in this way. Especially when most of the discussion really needs to be around the people that are abusing power and continuing to prevent people from having the discussion in the first place about punishing people in positions of power. Like, that's kind of the bigger problem right now. So while I do appreciate this discussion for what it is, I do think that in terms of time, maybe in 10, 20 years, if we have solved these problems, probably closer to 50 to 80 years, this type of discussion will be looked back on and gone, it was a little bit ahead of its time. This is kind of what ahead of its time looks like, is that the current climate is not the right place to be having this discussion. And it's not that people can't see what the discussion is, it's that what is needed to advance the situation towards a better resolution than what we have isn't what this is. This discussion, as interesting and good as this discussion is, it needs to be taken and it needs to be put up on a shelf, and we can have that discussion later, but there's a bigger problem right now that we need to deal with before we can get to that one. That one ends up acting as a distraction from what we need to deal with right now, and I understand that is kind of the problem, that is kind of at the core of the problem of Thriller Bark. That is the thing that, no matter how you cut it, that is still kind of a hole in the center of this story, is that we're having the wrong discussion here. And, to his credit, the entire story of One Piece seems to be a discussion about holding people with power to account for the abuses of their power, as we'll see in the next arc, with Marineford bringing in the Celestial Dragons, who are the embodiment of abuse of power. This is the core of the series right here. And so I can understand him trying to have this discussion on the side as a side piece to this discussion, to this debate, but and he is trying to make the main thrust of the story. the discussion that needs to be happening. He's just broadened it to be about, how power is abused, not just sexually, but all across the board, which is true. It's not just the raping that they're doing, it's also the killing that they're doing, and the use of fossil fuels that they refuse to stop doing, and the control over political parties that they seem to love to do. It's all of the abuses of power, the multiple abuses of power that they layer on top of each other in order to try and keep the world under their own thumbs. That is at the beating heart. It's the beating theme of One Piece, and at the core of the story is a call to action, is a call to, stop these people. Because we aren't going to have much of a world left soon if we don't. So, I have now gone overtime, from going undertime to overtime, and I need to hurry up and go help Granny. So, I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.